that we have the Vice-Chancellor with us today. And welcome to you all here, and welcome to those online. We'll have a sort of informal kind of conversation for about, 45 minutes, something like that. And then we'll go into a Q&A. If you're online, you can post questions, and I will try and keep my eye on that channel as well as in the hall itself. So, Debbie, thank you for coming. You have a busy schedule. Debbie's flown in from, and I've forgotten again, UAE this morning at some unearthly hour, so I'll have to try and keep her awake. I always like to know how people got to where they are. So you were a long way from home. You were brought up in Los Angeles, I believe?
Yes, the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a slightly different...
It's a different vibe, but
yeah.
it's equally far.
It's equally far, indeed, yes. So what took you from that beginning on your trajectory? Did you come from an academic family?
No. I did not come from an academic family at all, actually. Neither of my parents graduated from university. And so this is all a very new world to me, but I did grow up in California, post World War II California, so it was a huge expansion of California, a lot of people moving out there, and had a very, very ordinary childhood, actually just with my mom. I was raised by a single mom for most of my childhood, and but happened to do well in school. And it was a time in the United States, we're not quite in that time now, but it was a time in the United States when doing well in school got you far, and especially in a place like California where everybody went to state schools. It was big, everything was big and public, and so I enjoyed school. I loved school, and sort of found my home in school, and did well, and was able to go to university. I went to Stanford.
So you stayed in California to begin with. You didn't go that far.
You know, I wanted out. So I'm a fifth-generation Californian, which for somebody of my age is kind of extraordinary. You know, it's sort of pre-gold rush people, right? So I felt actually that it was time for to go and to move east. But I realized I was going into college at 17, and I just wasn't quite ready for that. So I decided to stay nearby for college, went to Stanford, and then by the time I got done with my bachelor's degree, it was really time to go.
And you've never looked back?
Yes, I have not.
So the American school system is very different in the sense that you did not have to specialize. You didn't have to say, I want to do psychology at 16 or something.
And thank heavens, because I wouldn't have.
Yeah, well, I'd like to explore that a bit. So at school, you say you were good at school. Did that mean you were good across the board? Do you think, I want to be a scientist? I mean, psychology is one of these strange things that sort of straddles science and social sciences. So.
Yes, strange. I was pretty good across the board. I was very good at math, actually. And one of the interesting things, I was actually recruited by MIT, which I couldn't have located on a map, and I couldn't quite tell why they were interested in me. But I knew I probably wasn't quite ready for them if I didn't know those things, right? So as an undergrad, so they would have been recruiting, trying to get women, trying to get girls to come on the basis of your test scores.
Well, MIT at that time hadn't got a very good record.
That's right, and they were trying to repair that record. So math and science were, it wasn't so much that I was better at those things, but it was odd. I mean, I was more distinctively good at those things, right. Especially for a girl.
I recognize that.
And so I ended up drifting in that direction. I thought I would be a doctor because I knew what that was. And so I sat through all of the, went through all of the pre-medical requirements. I was a biology major, and it just wasn't for me. It just wasn't for me. I would sit in a large lecture hall. Everybody had their head down over their books writing, and I was the one person with my head up saying, there must be more to life than this. So I was curious. I wandered to many different topics. I just was not very fully formed as a 17-year-old and 18-year-old. I was just beginning to discover the world of learning, all that was possible, and it took me a while to settle down.
But you had that opportunity, and it is so frustrating in this country. I mean, I don't know if you've had time to work this out, but this idea that at 14, essentially, you say, am I arts or science? I mean, it's just unhealthy, I think.
Well, then I think it seems, though, that then after you get your bachelor's degree, then you can actually say, okay, now what, right?
Yes, that's probably true, but what have you had the opportunity to fall into? I mean, one of the things I think is a real plus about the Cambridge system is we have natural sciences. So you can think, well, I've done physics, chemistry, and maths at A-level, so that's, I don't have to choose between physics and chemistry. And then I find that actually earth sciences is really interesting, or material science is really interesting, and you are able to do that,
right,
which you can't do at most universities. Right. But even so, if you suddenly decided that actually you wanted to do economics, you were good at maths, but you want to do economics, then you probably can't, you're stuck.
Can't get from here to there.
And the American system does give that freedom in a way that we lack. Yeah. And it is the really early decision-making that bothers me. And I think particularly at 14, so I'm now speaking as a physicist, at 14, as a girl, you probably feel physics, and the boys in your class probably say, well, girls don't do that. And I'm sure it's one of the reasons we have such a low uptake, whereas in the States, you can go and say, I'm sort of interested in science, I'll go and major in something, and you can fall into physics.
Yes. Absolutely. And people in the US, even once you have your bachelor's degree, then people do post-bac programs, and then so very many people will decide, women especially maybe, I think actually, as I think about my undergraduate students over the years, the ones I advised, it was very common for them to decide not to do science, but to do psychology, because they sort of were interested in science, and then to decide actually they wanted to be serious about science. And then there are post-baccalaureate programs that can transition you to medical school or to a career.
So sorry, baccalaureate in the way you are using it is a degree.
Yes.
Because baccalaureate in the French system would be at 18.
Correct. Right.
And EBAC here is sort of...
Right. Yeah. So these are called post-bac, and they mean post-bachelor degree programs.
Right. Okay.
To transition you. I actually think all of those kinds of programs are unbelievably helpful because it's a long life, and it's great to be able to change your mind, and you get some flowering of talent, right? At 22 or at 26 or whatever it is, right? Yeah.
I mean, the other thing that I deplore about our school system is that if you want to do science, you can't do... I mean, I wanted to do German A-level along with my science, and school couldn't cope with it, and I'm sure that it would be even harder now. I mean, the school was willing that I tried, but timetabling was just impossible. Yeah. You did a lot of music.
I did. I ended up being a double major in human biology and music. And it was because I had been a musician my whole life. I'd been a pianist, and midway through my time, and I went off to Stanford and decided I was going to get serious and study. And then I drifted back to piano and started taking piano lessons, and then thought, gee, actually I'm really interested in studying music, and actually drifted then into the bachelor's degree program. You can really drift in the United drift into degree programs.
But although it sounds a slightly pejorative word, you're actually using it in quite a positive sense.
Well, it enables a process of intellectual self-discovery that I think is actually enormously valuable. And there are things that I learned as a music student that I still use, just as there are things I learned as a biology. The systems thinking of biology I still use.
And which bits of music do you use?
I think for me, music, music is the ultimate kind of completely embodied. Performing music is a completely a full body, full mind experience, right? Yeah. I use a lot of what I learned about ensemble music in understanding human groups. It's a metaphor. It's an analytic system. It's many things for me.
And when you say understanding human groups, are you talking about your research or studying a committee dynamic?
There is no distinction between those. No, I mean, I'm very interested in groups and how they function. I'm interested in it in a scholarly, research-oriented way. I'm interested in it in an everyday a committee and group way. I'm very interested. I've always been fascinated by the tension, if you will, between the large-brained, egocentric, and I mean that in the technical sense. I mean, we see things through our own eyes. We see things from our own perspective. We see things, you know, we are motivated by our motives. We are distinct individuals, and yet we're adapted for social living. So we, our brains are formed for social living. Our ability to learn is about social living. So all of those adaptations that human beings have to be these unbelievably social creatures and to live in groups and to function in groups and to make decisions in groups while nonetheless retaining our, you know, fundamental individualized quality. That's what, that is what social psychology is, and that's what I've always found fascinating. And actually, I think for me, the American education system worked because I was fascinated in that when I was 2. Okay, I was, you know, from the crib, I was looking out at the world and trying to figure that out. And it took me a long, long time to find social psychology, which turned out to provide me with a set of tools for researching this and a set of concepts for understanding it, and an amazing array of phenomena to study. But but it was always what I was interested in, and it remains what I'm interested in. There are many, many ways to approach an interesting human phenomenon, and so for me, it's a very continuous trajectory, even though it doesn't look that way to other people.
So last term when I did this conversation, I did it with Gillian Tett, who is, of course, an anthropologist, and as well as a Financial Times journalist, and what is she, Provost of King's? And you know, her view was that anthropology and you know, the way anthropologists think should sort of permeate everything, business and probably committees too, though we didn't discuss that, because you know, it means you put yourself into someone else's position. Now, you sound as if you're standing a bit further back and just observing rather than trying to put yourself in someone else's position. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think that reflects the different methodologies of anthropology versus psychology. I think that's actually a true difference between those different disciplinary perspectives. I would actually agree with Gillian, and the book she wrote on this, Anthrovision, is one that I've read. I think that, but I do think that the participant-observer model of the anthropologist, see, psychologists are very wary of that sort of thing. With psychologists, it's always been trying to get the insight that you can only have through your own introspection.
Right.
And yet get the objectivity of the scientist.
Right.
And so you're always struggling with that tension there.
So does that mean you think psychology is closer to a hard science, as it were?
Psychology thinks it is, yes. And it aspires to be. It very much aspires to be a hard science. And that's why it's in divisions of natural science.
Yes.
And that's why it uses an experimental method. And it's been, especially for my part of psychology, especially for social psychology, it's been a double-edged sword.
Yes.
It has given the field a shared method, a shared aspiration, a shared understanding of what its project was. But, of course, you're not, you know, the data, I mean, if you actually, you as a physical scientist, I mean, if you saw the data that you would laugh, right? I mean, in a lot of ways, it would look to a experimental scientist in other branches of science like you're playing at something, but actually psychologists take it very seriously. You just can't measure things as precisely, right? And so you've got more error than you have signal, and it's just, I
mean, one of the things I'm vaguely aware of, so this may be very naive, but there seems, you know, this thing about the reproducibility crisis, as they call it.
Yes. So that's a crisis in the field of psychology, that many of the findings cannot be replicated.
And findings that people have believed in and acted upon,
built policies on, yes.
And Is there any way around that? I mean, I assume no one is fabricating, or not many people are fabricating data. It's just that it's so noisy you can't.
I think it's been a wake-up call for the field.
Right.
I think it's been extremely sobering. I think it has led psychologists to explore other methods.
Right.
So you will see now much more psychologists using existing data, using the data of actual behavior, scraping the web, as opposed to doing the traditional thing that psychologists have done, which is to measure behavior somehow, or measure self-reports of behavior, which are incredibly noisy, and then try to draw inferences.
I mean, it's part of the problem, the small data set.
Yes, and so the classics, how I was trained was you would have a hypothesis and you would create some situation in a laboratory and you would bring people in one at a time or in small groups and you would expose them to it, and it would take you a year to get 80 people in, and then you would draw inferences about human nature on the basis of your 80 people. And it's interesting, even when that method was the predominant method, people understood its weaknesses.
Yeah.
They just couldn't figure out another way to do it.
Right.
When those weaknesses were then exposed at a field-wide level with the replication crisis, they had to find new ways of doing business.
And before we move on, let me just ask, are there sort of policies that have been introduced that are going to be torn up because people realise that it was based on flawed data?
What I would say is there's healthy skepticism
Right.
about some amount of what psychologists have to offer. So, for example, nudges, right? The nudge approach to policymaking is one that really took off on the work of Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. Nobel Prizes were given. It was a big movement. I think the replication crisis has made people very wary of
Right.
the scientific basis for many of the nudges that are out there. Now, mind you, that doesn't mean that the approach doesn't have something to offer, but I do think that it's tarnished that approach.
I mean, certainly the government used to have a nudge unit here.
I think they still do, don't
But,
they?
well, apparently it's sort of outsourced, because I was talking to a civil servant from the Home Office this week who said that she felt that it actually had less oomph behind it now. No, it wasn't so embedded in government. So it is still there, but it's sort of a...
The shine's gone off it, there's no question, yeah.
Yeah, okay. I hadn't realised that the nudge concept itself was no longer as valued.
That came out of experimental, out of behavioral economics and social psychology, that idea that you could in fact have a behavior, you could understand behavior well enough to identify the place where just a nudge could change things.
Yes. So your own field, you looked at students drinking, I think.
That was one of the cases that I looked at, yes.
Yeah.
So the interest there, though, was in how people know how others feel.
Yes.
Right? How do people identify social norms and diagnose other people's feelings? And when do they get it wrong? And what does that mean?
And when I read about what you'd done there, it reminded me of impostor syndrome. I mean, the feeling that, most students in Cambridge, if not every student in Cambridge, thinks that everyone else is comfortable, that they are confident and all that.
It's similar. I think imposter syndrome, pluralistic ignorance, these are all places where we self-censor, right? Mm-hmm. Where we do not reveal how we truly feel, and where there's this outwardly we're projecting calm, composure, but inwardly we're sure that we're the only, that we're less smart than everybody, mm-hmm. that we're less comfortable than everybody. And there's certain qualities, in fact, that are much more likely to give rise to this disjunction. Qualities like people all think they're shyer than everybody else, right? Because you don't see shyness in another person. You see extroversion, you don't see introversion. So people think they're shyer. They think they're more anxious. They think that they're more self-doubting than everybody else.
How do we reassure people?
It's really by getting people to reveal themselves to each other. It's by creating conditions in which people can, in fact, reveal their own feelings to each other. And of course, colleges, Churchill and others are an excellent place to try to create those kinds of more trusting, more open dynamics.
I mean, we certainly try and talk about imposter syndrome so that students realize that it isn't just them.
Right.
Right. It's probably true of fellows who think it's just me.
That's right.
So,
That's right.
So did you get involved with much policy making?
I taught for the last 10 years that I was at Princeton, including while I was an administrator. I taught in the policy school.
Right.
That particular policy school, the policy school at Princeton, had very early on gotten into psychology and behavioral science. It was one of their specialties. One of my colleagues, Danny Kahneman, who is famous for his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, he brought psychology and behavioral science to the policy school in the 1990s.
Because he was actually an economist, wasn't he?
No, he was not. He was a psychologist.
Oh, he won the Nobel Prize for
Sorry,
he won the
Nobel Prize for economics because his early work with Amos Tversky, in fact, probed the ways in which human behavior departed from standard economic models that are the basis for so much policy.
Yeah, okay. But I was wondering if you worked with the civil servants here. I don't know what the corresponding phrase would be, government officials.
Yes, certainly we did work with them, and in our courses in the policy school, we trained them.
Right, yes.
Because people who would go on to that.
I mean, as I say, I was talking to this civil servant from the Home Office through the CSAT program, the Centre for Science and Policy, and we don't offer students here anything, or in the sciences, at undergraduate level about policy. And I think, it troubles me, partly because there aren't enough scientists in the civil service, but also because, particularly with things like climate change and whatever, that policy angle is fundamental. And the idea, I worry we talk to our students and say, here are the facts. If you explain them in words of one syllable, then people will understand it. And that's not true of the general public, of course, because they will have all other kinds of things coming into play. But it's also not true. A policymaker may understand it, but still not be able to turn it into policy because of political realities, if you like. And I wouldn't have known a thing about this when I was an undergraduate, but I just worry that maybe we should give them a little more exposure.
I mean, I think that would be. I think that would be wonderful, right? There's a lot to do.
Oh, well, there you are. That's your challenge.
Yes, exactly. There's a lot to do. So
yes.
I'm not sure that we can
No,
do everything,
I'm sure that's not top of your list of priorities. But I just feel a lecture on harsh political realities might be good for practically anyone in this university.
Certainly for a vice chancellor.
Have you not met harsh political realities yet? Okay, so you started at Stanford. I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to your sort of trajectory. You started at Stanford and then you moved east. You didn't go to MIT.
I did not.
You went to Yale. Did you think about going to MIT by that point? I mean, I guess it's not. Psychology is perhaps not.
No, once I went the psychology direction, I was looking at, universities that specialized, and Yale was an extremely good and historically good psychology program, and was very good for what I was interested in. They had a history of excellent training in what was called social action research. I was actually very interested in research that could change the world.
Right.
Small aspirations.
Yeah. And how different was the East Coast from the West Coast? I mean, you're halfway to Cambridge in
Yes,
by this point.
I was on my way. It was very different. It's 3,000 miles. It's unfathomably large country.
Yeah.
So it was very different. That said, and this is also my experience of coming to Cambridge as well, the work was similar, right? The people were similar. The aspiration, the inspiration was quite similar. So it wasn't as difficult to make the transition as one might think, and I was up for it. I was really eager to be somewhere new, learn in a new way, learn from new people. It was great.
You didn't have culture shock in the
No, and I think, graduate school is all about, being a postgrad is all about digging deep into something. And, I think I look back on that time with, enormous affection because it was really just all-consuming. Just how can I, what can I learn and how can I use the methods of this discipline to learn more?
Yes, I mean, that all-consuming thing, I know when I've talked to my own PhD students and they're thinking about their future and say, if you are not totally consumed, you should go off and do something else,
Right.
Don't try and stay in academia.
Right.
And it is a joy to be in that sort of bubble.
Yeah, that immersion.
Yeah. But you didn't stay at Yale.
No, I didn't. And I'm so glad I didn't, actually. It was Yale, like most U.S. programs, encourages people to go away after they get their degree. So it's very unusual in the American system to stay in one place all the way through, which it's much more common here that people would stay on.
Certainly is in Cambridge, yes.
Yeah, whereas in the United States, the idea is you go someplace, take what you learned, go some. So there's constant, it's, remixing, right, of training and backgrounds. So yeah, I went to Princeton from Yale.
And then you stayed there for quite a long time.
And then I did stay there for a long time, but that was a job.
Not all-consuming?
It was all-consuming, especially early on. I think being a young academic, in the American system, there's a run to tenure, right? And at Princeton, when I went there, the tenure rate was, I think, about 30%. 30% of people who started got tenure, something like that.
And that was men and women?
And men and women. And so that seemed daunting. So it was, all I did for about 6 years was try to build the record that would, in fact, enable me to stay.
Now, one of the things that I find shocking about the States is they don't have statutory maternity leave.
No, and they'd never heard of maternity leave when I had my first child, so.
Princeton specifically? Yeah.
It was
okay.
not a thing.
I kind of recognize that from here. But how do you cope? I mean, I remember, probably before I had my own children, attending a conference in the States and hearing two women chatting and saying, well, if I conceive now, then I can have the child during the summer vacation. And I thought, for goodness sake, life doesn't work like that. And that's a terrible position to push people into.
It's evolved a lot over the years, and I like to think that real progress has been made. I mean, there is now, parental leave, actually, for both parents. There's...
in the States?
Yes. It's not state given. It's institution by institution.
I think academia is better.
But that's in the States, there's almost nothing that the government provides. But it's the market, it's the competition between universities for academic talent that produces pretty much the same thing. And so one way that when you're trying to recruit young academic talent, one thing they're judging you on is whether you have good policies for parental leave.
Right. And it's easy to find that out. Because one of the things that I've heard complained about the colleges, I mean, I don't know which particular college, but I have certainly heard this, that it's very hard to find this information out. So if you are trying to work out, if I take this junior research fellowship and I then want to have a family, what happens? Being transparent about these things.
Yeah, well, it's because you're advertising. I mean, it's just a completely different, it's hard to even express how different it is, right?
Yeah.
But it's the competitive system between universities, but that means you have to advertise.
Yeah, okay. So you managed to fit in 3 children?
I did. I was a department head for the last one. But.
And how long did you take off?
I mean, she was born in April. Summer came. I mean, that wasn't the plan.
Well, they don't turn up to plan.
They don't. And so I think, like, In fact, my husband and I were both chairs at that time. He was history and I was psychology. And yes, she didn't turn up to plan, but I think one doesn't plan a career really anyway, and one certainly doesn't plan a life, or if one does,
it goes wrong.
It goes wrong. So, I think what I would say about academic life is that it's enormously forgiving, even administration is enormously forgiving, I think. And it's because we are a people factory, we cultivate people, right? And you have to be forgiving of all kinds of things if you're gonna try to take 17 and 18-year-olds and turn them into functioning adults, not much less, at all stages. And I think that ethos, therefore, does pervade the place a bit.
I suspect we may have some postdocs in the audience, and I think they would say it was not a forgiving world. I mean, I understand exactly what you mean, and when I had my children, the flexibility, the lack of requirement of presenteeism was wonderful. Mm-hmm. But if you are on a short-term contract, mm-hmm. it doesn't feel forgiving at all.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's right. I think it underlies it's not just postdocs. I think there are a number of people, sort of categories of staff who are on short-term contracts, and it isn't forgiving. I mean, the culture is forgiving. People are forgiving in the moment, but your future is not guaranteed.
Exactly, and I think that once you've got your position, and even more so once you've got tenure in the American system, then that's fine. But it's this difficult, and this idea. UCU put out a report yesterday, I think, talking about how shocking it is that so many staff are on short-term contracts. And of course they're talking about the postdocs. And I think it's a real challenge to think what the system, in this country, in the States, wherever, what the system can do, particularly in sciences. I mean, it's not quite the same issue in the arts. How do we change that system to remove this stage, which is so insecure?
Well, and a variable length.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
How long people spend and how many postdocs they do. Yeah, it's a very difficult problem.
I mean, it's just not obvious to me how one can change it. I mean, people who say, well, if you're good enough to get a postdoc, you should, then be guaranteed a job. But then you would have a generation that got the jobs. And we saw this in this country when in the new universities opened in the 60s, people had lectureships for life. And there'd been this great expansion, so there was a generation that then sat there, and it made it much harder for the ones who came after. And that's what worries me about the idea of let's make it easy for these people, because it would not solve the problem in the long term.
I do think, so I worked on this a lot at Princeton on trying to find the right kind of provisioning for postdocs. I think giving them more than 1 year, giving them 3 years, giving them security within that, giving them parental benefits, giving them proper benefits. That you can't give them a guarantee of continuing employment, but you can at least try to do the best you can within the terms that of their stage of career.
But of course, particularly for the woman, if you've got a 3-year contract, it's still a challenge to start a family.
Right. So what we did actually was stop the contract and so extend it, therefore.
Right. Yes, I think in essence that's probably what happens here, but it's still kind of, if you stop the contract, you stop the pay, and maternity pays. It's a really complicated situation.
It is very, very complicated, And there's some very, very talented people at that career stage.
Absolutely, right? And they are vital for the ecosystem. I'm conscious of the time. We lost a bit of time due to the interruption, but I'm sure there are people, I can see there are some questions coming in online, and I'm sure there are others. We could talk all evening, or we'll have a chance over dinner, but I probably should throw it open at this point. We have some mics since... Yes, mics. So we've got mics. So I'll start with one of the questions online from Heber. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that. I was wondering, how often do you advise students to follow through their passions in terms of choosing their own path in terms of academia and beyond, What things did you find the most challenging, and how did you mitigate them?
So I always tell students to follow their passions. That's what university is for. Life will, you won't be able to always follow your passions in life, but you should do so certainly while you're a student and for as long as possible. What challenges did I encounter? I mean, many. I think along the way, I certainly had financial challenges when I was at Stanford, and even when I was at Yale. It was always I was always trying to make money, always. Usually trying to combine that somehow with learning something, or, so I had 4 jobs at a time, and I was just constantly running around trying to make ends meet. So there were those kinds of challenges. Certainly, I think the tenure track we've talked about the precarity of many positions in academia, and that's actually a problem I didn't have because I just went straight through and I didn't do a postdoc. So I didn't have the precarity problem. I had the tenure track problem, which was, this all-consuming 6 years of nothing but work. And then you come out the other side. And again, I'm very interested in human motivation. And you're focused here, and then you have tenure. And then you have to reorient your motivational system to now think, okay, I have continuing employment. What do I want to do with it? Well, that's actually, it's a fabulous thing, but it's very odd motivationally, right? You've been very short-term oriented for quite some time, and now you really want to take advantage of what tenure gives you, what continuing employment gives you. It took me years to get reoriented to that. It really was almost like, well, now what do I do, right? I achieved my goal.
You don't have to do anything.
That's right, but that's not a good feeling, right?
No.
So I think, and then I think deciding to come here was interesting. I mean, I had done every job at Princeton, almost, except the president. I had gotten to be provost, and I'd come up through the ranks, and I had to decide whether I should be, picking out my headstone in the Princeton cemetery or moving on and trying something completely new. And what I chose, and I am thrilled that I chose it. But that's a non-trivial decision. When I was dean of the faculty, one of the projects, I didn't stay in that position very long, just really 2.5 years. It was 3, but by 2.5 years, I had my next position, and I was moving on. But one of the projects that I actually thought would have been a great one to do, that I really wanted to do, was to look at different life stages for academics, and especially, for example, mid-career, right? After you're established, but when you really need to gear up for that second major thing you're going to do, right? For your second book, or for you've done your dissertation, and you've published something, and that's gotten you, now you've got a job for life, right? And then what? Because I found that juncture a particularly tricky one, and I think some number of people don't quite make the next. They don't quite make the next step. And but they're fabulous people, right? It just turns out that's actually pretty hard to do. And if you have opportunities to try things, if you have coaching, if you have, there are a lot of different things that you could do, in fact, to nurture people through that stage. And if you nurture people through that stage, you can have unbelievable flowering afterward. And I think this is, I don't know, it's true for men and women, but I think it's especially true, I think, for women, because it often coincides with potential decisions to have children and things like that are going to take time out from what actually, you think, okay, I have tenure, I have some expanse, but there's actually some intense work that needs to happen there, where you decide what your real contribution is going to be.
Yes, exactly.
And that can, in fact, come at the same time that you're deciding what to do on the family front. So, I think these are first world problems, and I recognize that, but nonetheless, they are problems to be solved.
Right, do we have some questions from the hall? There's one there.
Thank you both very much for a really interesting talk. I just wanted to pick up on the thread of what you were discussing about postdocs and also different stages of life and moving through them. It's always interesting coming to talks like this because depending on which generation of speaker is attending, they had themselves a different journey through being a postdoc into their current position or continuing job. For me, my current generation of postdocs, I see a lot of people disappearing into industry. In my own area, it seems like about 2/3 of the medical postdocs have gone to work for AstraZeneca in the last couple of years. Do we have things to learn from from industry and tech and pharma? Is academia kind of on the back foot, and do we need to do things a little bit differently? And did you have similar kind of thoughts yourself about moving into industry? Thank you.
Yeah, so I actually think people moving into industry is not a bad thing. It's a good thing because they're using the skills, the research skills that they have gained through their education for good, and to accomplish things. I think we tend to think that what we're training people for is academia. We have to get over that. Because there just aren't enough jobs. There's not enough space for all people. And there's a real need for the kind of training that people get through their postgrad work, the research skills. There's a real need for that in a lot of different professions. So I think opening, changing our way of thinking about success and about how you use the skills that you, and about just, it's such a long career, it's such a long life, can do so many different things. And even I've known of people who in fact have gone into industry assuming that they'd given up the academic track and then come back, right? So I think it's true, industry is increasingly where a lot of subject field postdocs are going. But, they're going off and they do AI somewhere and we'll see them back. We'll see them back.
Right, question behind.
Quite rightly, there's focus both internally and externally on culture and how we promote inclusive cultures. Are there lessons that you think you learned in Princeton that can apply to Cambridge?
Yes, I think both what to do and not. I should say Princeton is a very different organization than Cambridge. It had advantages. It had some advantages and some disadvantages for creating an inclusive culture. Its advantage was that it was in a very centralized university. So there was one staff and one faculty and one student body and one student experience. I mean, it's really a very centralized place. Now, what I can tell you about centralized places like that is it is easier to say, it's like a club and you're in, right? And the barriers to entry are so high that once you get in, well, you're in, and then you're a member of the club and you're included. Except that there's a reason why I did my work on pluralistic ignorance in Princeton, because that kind of a culture means huge numbers of people, and in some cases, virtually everybody thinks that they're not as in as other people are in, right? I mean, the very existence of those norms makes you feel like a deviant. Whereas Cambridge has a million ways to be in, right? People are in the colleges and they're in the university and they're in this institute and that institute. It makes it very hard to create an overall inclusive culture, but much easier for people to be included somewhere. And there's not, given that there's not one way of being, you can just be, a card-carrying member of the Isaac Newton Institute or something. I choose that just because that's the most recent sort of enclave that I went to, that has its own culture, its own, and a very strong sense of inclusion in itself, right? That you could be at Churchill, right? You could, so I think that there's creating inclusion here, it's a very different animal. There are many different ways of being at Cambridge. I think that's fantastic. I think that enables a range of personal expression to coexist with a real sense of inclusion. But it also creates challenges because it's such a many-headed beast, right? So that in fact there is no sort of hallmark of what it means to be at Cambridge.
All right, there's a question at the back in the middle, please.
I think first of all, I would like to thank both of you for doing this. I brought my son along because I think when I was growing up, I didn't have this kind of role model. And I think this is a great opportunity to show younger generation. And I work in tech, and one thing that I've been thinking a lot is how do we actually bring up younger generations? Like when I was growing up, it's all about specialization. You know, you specialize. I did masters in chemical engineering where, you know, we dive into, you know, thermodynamics, physics, but now I ended up in business and tech. I'm just wondering what would be useful skill set for younger generation. Is it multidisciplinary or is it specialization? Is it the soft skills or is it the hard skill? Or is it curiosity? I think that's something that I have been asking around and try to understand what's the best way to actually bring up younger generation.
Right, well, I don't think there's any one answer to that. But what I would say is, you know, if you read about the world that they are entering as compared to the worlds of, you know, that the rest of us have inhabited, it's a world, it's so much more of a fluid world. They will have so many jobs in so many different industries. And so how do you raise children to be prepared for what comes, right? They're very likely to face a much more rapidly changing planet than we faced. I mean, we're now aghast at the way the planet is changing. Well, that's only gonna accelerate, right, for them. I think for those with that in mind, with that picture of the future in mind, I do think training skills like curiosity, flexibility, training them to be, to have the capacity to flex with things, training them to be, multifaceted, to be prepared to change course, and to be solid enough with themselves that they can do that, you know, without damage to self, right? I think trying to raise robust children who can roll with the punches is the best advice I could give.
Another question. Is that next to Vivian?
Thank you. I'm wondering if there's any advice regarding becoming a female leadership, especially in the context of academia.
You know, I think there are a lot of different kinds of leadership in academia and a lot of opportunities for it. And what I would say is finding the way you want to exert leadership is what's important. I know, for example, both female and male, but heads of research groups or laboratories, that's leadership. And it's incredibly important leadership because, in fact, the people who, your trainees, I mean, their lives depend on your example and your mentorship and your support and your leadership. And I know I can think of, I mean, my mind immediately goes to the people I know who are just gifted at that, right? Who are just wonderful at bringing up young academic talent. Then there are people, I think, who really flourish in roles like department head, who, you know, love to build their discipline, love to hire in new academic staff and bring them up. I would count myself as one of those. I loved that job. I was the department head of psychology at Princeton for 12 years, and the people that we hired and watching them flourish, and people who, you know, they weren't like the people in my lab. They were fully themselves, right? And they were going to go off and do things that I could never do. I just loved that. That was fantastic. The job I do now is just a leadership job of a very different sort. It's so broad, right? It's very broadly trying to set institutional policies and create environments that serve, the multiplicity of ways of being at the University of Cambridge. It's actually fascinating, so interesting, but it is a completely different job than those other jobs I did. I may have needed to do them to get here, right? It's a little like, continuing. I've always been interested in what was over the horizon, right? And sort of, continuing sort of an increasingly expansive view. And so now I worry a lot about, UK higher education and the whole sector and global higher education and how are we gonna educate all those refugees and things I never thought about before, right? That's leadership of a very different sort. So I guess my message is, if you want it, the opportunities are there. Finding what gives you, it's important that it give you fulfillment and meaning as well. Right, leadership is a two-way street. So finding sort of the level of leadership that you are comfortable and find meaningful. And then, again, it's a long career, right? Recognizing that there is always a horizon and there's always a broader view that you can adopt.
Right, all the questions seem to be over here. I don't know, that side have gone to sleep.
Maybe because we're looking over here. But
No,
anyway.
no, I keep looking over there.
Makes it easier for the mic.
Yeah, well, yes, that's true.
Thank you very much. You seem to have sailed through your career. Professor Prentice made it sound very easy. I'm just thinking in today's world where STEM and science are very much promoted as being the way forward. I'm a doctor, I have a job, there's no problem. One of my sons, who's an English DPhil, it's very hard for the arts to be valued these days. Universities, departments in art subjects are not expanding. If anything, they're shrinking, it seems to me. How would you advise people in the arts world? How do we get these skills that they learn? How can they be valued in today's world when science is so promoted and held in such high esteem? When actually art students learn critical thinking, analysis, communication, which you would think would be highly valued.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very good question. I don't think the opportunities for people with those skills are as limited as it feels like to them when they're here, right? So I too have I have actually two of my three are arts kids. So and one of them is still young and forming, but. My oldest is studied Arabic and Persian languages and cultures and literatures, and so what do you do with that, right? And well, he's actually gone into book trade, and he's working for publishers, and the skills are actually incredibly valuable there. So I think the world of letters and arts and culture still exists and flourishes on the talents of the people who come through those degree programs. We just don't talk about it as much, right? And all of our examples of how AI is going to do us in, it's going to do them, and it's going to, AIs are going to be painting paintings and taking photographs, and it's just interesting the way it went that way, because AIs are actually going to be doing everything, including like a lot of coding, so we're going to need fewer coders too, but we don't talk about that. We just worry about the arts and humanities. I actually, one of the things I've enjoyed about coming to Cambridge is that the arts and humanities here are somewhat spunkier. In the States, there's a mood of crisis and gloom, whereas actually the work that's going on here, a lot of the work that I've found in the schools of arts and humanities and social sciences is very relevant and very much forward-looking and really does take those skills into a lot of domains that you wouldn't even expect, right? You wouldn't even expect to find them. So I'm much more optimistic. I do think we need to change the narrative, though.
I'm conscious of the time. I know there are lots more questions, but I think we should draw this to a close. There will be drinks in the buttery if you want to stay, but thank you so much. It's been brilliant.
Thank you.